Good morning.
Good morning.
Sure was good to see the kids marching around this morning. When I was a kid, many of you know that I had a pretty rough childhood, and that I had suffered a great deal of abuse. And abuse is one thing, but I think sometimes fear does even more damage than the physical abuse and things. That sometimes when those physical marks heal, there's still not just emotional scars, but just damage that's done. You know, fear is a powerful thing. There are times that it can paralyze us, times that it galvanizes us to action. There are times that fear torments us and changes us, steals our innocence for what seems like forever. Sometimes fear leaves its mark on us without us ever experiencing what it is that we feared the most. And probably if I look back at my life and look at the ways that my worst fears, nearly every time, it never came into being what it was that I feared the most. When I was around 14, my mom had this on-again, off-again relationship with this guy who was actually a meth dealer. And he was a little bit crazy. His name was Mike. And Mike had these big, giant scars on his wrists. And I asked him what those scars were for. And it turns out that when he was on drugs one day, he was hallucinating, and he saw a bald man that looked kind of sinister, I guess, while he was tripping on drugs. And he ran, he thought it was the devil. And he ran from this guy. And he actually climbed a power pole out of fear. He got to the top of the power pole and touched the live wires, and it blasted him from the power pole. And he fell all the way to the ground, and the doctors told him that while he was falling, his heart was stopped. And the only reason he was alive was that when he hit the ground, it restarted his heart. This is just one of many boyfriends that my mom had, this kind of revolving door father-childhood that I had. And you can see that this is kind of a vacuum, you know, in a person's life. And so this was just one person, but one time when he was really kind of freaked out on drugs, he was just really paranoid, and he was really acting really erratic. And he came by the house afraid that people were trying to kill him, afraid that the cops were chasing him. And I was about 14 years old, and he wanted to grab me and my brother and my mom and take us away. And I remember being extremely afraid of him. And I went to the kitchen, and I was able to grab a kitchen knife and hide it underneath my coat. And no one knew that I had that knife but me. And as we drove to wherever it was he wanted to go, he was freaking out, and he would follow, like a car would drive by, and he would twist around to see if it was a cop or think it was going to turn around and start following us. And it was just really insane. And I was just really worried, and I remember just clutching that knife, squeezing that knife, and feeling like if my worst fear came true, if this guy just finally snapped, the only thing that was going to keep me and my mother and my brother safe was me and that knife. And we were able to drop him off and let him go and convince him that we didn't need to stay with him. And as we were driving away, slightly rattled, I remember that experience, that little bit of comfort that knife brought me. And after a couple other experiences like that with some pretty deranged people, I remember never feeling like I could be anywhere without the knife. Without the knife at my side, I felt uncomfortable. I felt like I needed to kind of be armed, or something horrible was going to happen to me. It took me 12 years to get over that, to just get over that fear, the impression that fear had made on me. And I still carry a pocket knife today, but it's not like I think about it as a weapon anymore. I think about it as a tool, and I use it often. You know, I was a kid in the 80s, and I remember having this vacuum, you know, this father figure in my life that was really missing, or abusive, or just all these problems. I remember thinking about all those movies from the 80s, you know, those action, superhero kinds of movies, you know. Didn't matter if it was Arnold Schwarzenegger or Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris or John Wayne. I remember looking up to these people, the hero, you know, this person who was tough enough to make it through whatever it was that life would throw at them. And as a kid with that vacuum in my life, I kind of looked at these people and tried to emulate these kind of people, because I wanted something that they had. One of my favorite hero types was the Clint Eastwood type, you know? That kind of steely-eyed Western guy. And he was usually played a role that was mean, but it wasn't just that he was mean. It was that he was powerful enough to be mean. That if someone messed with him, you know it was going to go bad for them. And he went through, it always go through the same pattern. You know, he went through this horrible tragedy, and it was an excuse for him to justify this big killing spree or whatever. I mean, that's the plot of all those movies. But I remember looking at that and thinking, you know what, I wish I was like that. I wish I was ready. When someone came my way, that they would regret it. So I tried to harden myself, to make myself like that kind of character. You know? So I wanted to be tough enough to outlast any kind of conflict. Tough enough that when the forces outside of my control invaded my life, that I would be ready. The key word here, of course, is I. You know, I had long since given up on other people because there was a string of people who had let me down. You know, when I got in that position where I had to trust somebody and be vulnerable, oftentimes they would betray that trust. I would regret it. Sometimes they would hurt me or hurt people I love. And so I kind of got to this place where I thought, you know, if I just trust myself, then everything will be fine. Because I know I can kind of trust myself. I might let myself down once in a while, but it's just safer that way. It's just safer to rely completely on myself. You know, being a follower isn't something that we celebrate in this culture. It's not something that we celebrate at all. You know, when was the last time that you were complimented for your followership? Or gave someone a compliment for their followership rather than their leadership? I can't think of a single time I've ever heard that kind of compliment. You know, the only place in our culture that being a follower is given at least the slightest tip of the hat to is Twitter, the social network. You know, how many followers do you have? And I think, you know, being a follower on Twitter costs you nothing. Just a click. It takes an instant. It costs you absolutely nothing. Requires nothing of us. I think it's no accident that that's kind of the only version of follower that we celebrate. You know, everybody wants to be the boss. Everybody wants to sit at the head of the table and be the one that makes things happen. A few centuries before Jesus, there was a man named Alexander the Great. He conquered most of the known world through using military strength, his own strategic genius, just a little bit of ruthlessness and cleverness, and just a little tiny hint of diplomacy. Most of the time it was just an all-out war. The story is told that before Alexander the Great had a big army of followers, he went to this city and he demanded that the king come and talk to him. And he told the king of this big walled city that he needed to surrender right then and there to him. And the king looked at him and kind of laughed and thought, well, you know, you don't really have that big of an army, and I got these walls to protect me. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to me? And Alexander gave the king a demonstration. He took all of his men, he put them in single file, and he marched them right toward a cliff. And he didn't hesitate, he didn't stop, and his men kept marching and kept marching. And 10 of his men walked right off the edge of the cliff to their death without even flinching. After 10 men had dropped off the edge, he called his men back to his side, and he looked at the king and demanded that the king give up the city again. And the king did. The king and all the people who'd watched this just knew that one way or another, if this kind of obedience was commanded by this king, one way or another, this guy would never give up. One way or another, he would take that city. So they just gave up right there on the spot. You know, I think we should ask ourselves sometimes if we're willing to do this sort of thing. You know, are we willing to be that sort of obedient to the King of the universe, Jesus himself? You know, are you dedicated enough that you would follow him even if it cost you everything? So think how much power and influence Christ would have in the world if we had even just a smidgen of that kind of obedience and dedication. Imagine for just a minute what it would look like if we gave up trying to be like Alexander and just let God have ourselves fully. I think sometimes we forget that Jesus' kingdom is a not of this world sort of kingdom. It's an upside down kingdom. It's a kingdom that demands of us a level of trust that few of us are comfortable with, because it might cost us everything. It requires us to trust God fully and not just to depend on ourselves like we often do. Deep within us all is a fear of that, a fear of fully stepping out in our faith, a fear that when we put our trust in God, He will let us down just like so many other people have. And I think there's a real temptation, especially those of us who have experienced even more brokenness, maybe abuse, to try to follow that temptation of finding a walled city, a place that we can be safe, or we can be protected, or even to make our hearts into a walled city, rather than learn to trust God. It's often easier that way, to arm ourselves than to think about trusting God and just trusting that He will provide for us. And so rather than trust in God like I did when I was a kid, sometimes we try to magnify our own powers. We try to accumulate and prepare and worry and try to be powerful. And I think to this temptation, the devil whispers to us in our ear, whether we realize it or not, all this I will give to you if you will bow down and worship me. Now, we may not be the Son of God, but we each face struggles just as He did. He was tempted in the same ways that we are. Last week I talked about the struggle of getting our identity from places other than God. This week I want to go beyond that to getting our security from other places than God. Deep within us is this river of fear that's wrapped around our securities, and some of us are completely unaware of it and its influences in our lives, its ability to pull our strings, to guide our decisions. And as Christians, we're called to follow Jesus once again through another desert, the desert of our own insecurities. As a man, Jesus struggled with the same things that we struggle with, following God into harm's way. In fact, he did it even more so than because He knew that He would be rejected and crucified. He knew that He was following God directly into harm's way. He knew it in advance. And it's hard for us to give up that kind of security, especially when we know for a fact that we're going to get hurt by that experience. And here was an opportunity to avoid all of that. There was just one catch. You had to do it the devil's way. But what a shortcut. Don't think it wouldn't have been tempting to completely avoid the cross and the pain and misery that He would face and just take a shortcut right there to the crown. How many of us would choose the cross over the crown? William Penn, the namesake of the college just down the road, he wrote a book about this called No Cross, No Crown. In his words, he wrote it because he wanted to show that the nature and discipline of the holy cross of Christ, and that the denial of self is alone, only the way to rest to the rest and kingdom of God. And you might be, well, who is this guy to tell us about this sort of thing? But William Penn wrote this pamphlet attacking the people of his day, these kind of Christians who were taking a lot of things for granted about God. They were kind of complacent in their faith. He wrote this pamphlet. It was something about a Sandy Foundation, I forget. And he got locked up in jail for that. And he was from a powerful family. He could have apologized and said the word, and he would have been released right then and there. Instead of doing that, he waited in a horrible English prison for years until his trial came, and he could have his defense. And he did this because he believed that to compromise for the sake of his own comfort would have been to forfeit truly following Jesus. He really believed that. And like Jesus, Penn could have taken the shortcut. He could have gotten out of that thing. And it would have been far easier to do that than to deny himself and his own needs for security. but he hung on knowing that God would make even the suffering that he experienced a redemptive thing. And God did. When Penn went to his trial and stood up and defended himself eloquently, he brought a victory for truth that the world had not seen before that, especially the Quaker world. He brought with him the ability for the world to start taking the Quakers seriously again. The thing is that when we attempt to get our security needs met from strange places, that we're actually, whether we realize it or not, we're putting something else on top of God's throne. Some knowingly put themselves up there, at the very top. And they do this consciously, knowing that they're expecting the whole world to revolve around them. And some of us do it unconsciously, unaware of the fear that's inside us, pulling our strings. And people like me who have experienced abuse might be completely unaware even of how this happens to us, and how much fear is really there, and how much it's really shaping and shifting and moving through us. I think we each cling to that knife in our own way. If you grew up poor, it might look like a 401k, or a Rolex, or a freezer full of food. If you were hurt, it could be the mask of anger, like that Clint Eastwood character staring into the camera. Or it could be jumping from relationship to relationship because you're afraid to be alone. In Celebrate Recovery, there's these 8 spiritual principles that come from the Beatitudes, and they spell this acrostic recovery. And the first one starts with the letter R, and it's this: realize I'm not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing, and that my life is unmanageable. The beatitude that goes along with this is, happy are those who know they are spiritually poor. Excuse me. Ultimately, I think the antidote for us grappling with this fear is recognizing our needs before God. Our need for him to be in charge, to trust in him to meet our needs. As Jesus put it, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. I think men especially struggle with getting our identity from providing or making sure that things are secure, not trusting God to take care of us, but trusting in ourselves, relying on ourselves. And when we do that, I think we minimize God and his influence in our hearts. God calls us to the source, not the substitute. And there are many substitutes out there begging for our trust, begging us not to walk the road to the cross, begging us to follow some kind of primrose path that leads somewhere else completely. And when we build the kingdoms where we're in control, we can too easily forget the bigger plans and purposes of God, and we kind of silo ourselves into these little fiefdoms. God's plans are far above that. They're far above our little houses that want to become our castle. And I think it sure is better that God is on the throne rather than one of us, rather than our fears sitting up on that throne. As the saying goes, when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, pretty soon everything looks like a set of nails. And I think in order to live in this upside-down kingdom that God calls us to, we have to let go of the hammer. We have to embrace that the kingdom of God is a kingdom where we operate through the true path to strength is the path of weakness. It's not the path that walks silently around our fears carrying a big stick. It's a path that goes straight through our fears, trusting that whatever happens to us, God will be with us. It's a path that trusts that even if people mistreat you, even if they put you on a cross, that God can still somehow use that for his glory, for his purposes, for his kingdom. The truth is that we can't control the things that will happen to us in this life. We will all experience pain and brokenness. Doesn't matter how paranoid you are, or how much guns and ammunition and canned food you have in the basement, it's not going to be enough. The only way that you'll be safe is if God makes you safe. And I think building our own little kingdoms to keep us safe is the exact opposite of taking up our cross following Jesus. It's probably the biggest distraction to that there is. And whether that looks like chasing after the life of a gated community or pondering too much about your zombie-proof lair, it's all the same thing. It's not trusting God. I think God wants us to be wise about how we live our lives. We aren't supposed to have faith in contingency plans. We're not supposed to have faith in putting our trust in the things that we can squirrel away in this life. We aren't even supposed to trust that the government with its soldiers and guns and bombs will take care of us. We're supposed to put our trust in God, even when that requires trusting Him literally for our daily bread. Jesus teaches us, for what profit is it if someone gains the whole world and loses their soul? So we can't approach the Christian life as if it were all about temporal things like those things behind us. God might call some people to leadership. He might call some people to those places. But it's not about our kingdoms. And when we bow down to other things for the sake of our own safety and security, these things that are so attractive, that call us to worship them, it's a knock against our relationship with God. God calls us to the source, not the substitute. To take a look at whether we're really trusting God or whether underneath it all it's just a gloss. To ask ourselves if we're really trying to fit ourselves into God's kingdom or whether we're trying to fit Him into our kingdom. So many of us wrestle with what I like to call a Jesus plus life. It's kind of like a little bit of Jesus plus what we were already going to do anyway. And when we clench our fists around things, whether we realize it or not, that's the thing that's actually controlling us. As followers of Jesus, God calls us to open up our hands, to let God fully take everything in Him and give us back what it is that He wants for us, His will for us, to fill them again with what He desires. And Jesus did that. So as we think about these things, maybe as we go into open worship, I just ask you to open your hands. You know, maybe there's something that you're putting your trust in, your security needs, your fears. There's something that might be hampering your relationship with God. But as you sit in the silence, maybe just open your hands and let God maybe take these things from us. If you're new and you don't understand what open worship is, it's a time of listening for how God might be speaking. We believe that God speaks still, and even through us. He might be tapping you on the shoulder with the message. He might speak to you, but He also might speak to you through you to all of us. So if you feel God tapping on your shoulder, feel free to stand and the microphone will be brought to you. And I just ask that you please wait for that microphone if you do feel led to speak, because there are a lot of people who won't be able to hear you if you don't. So thank you.